Very warm welcome to you all. I'm Janice Goldstraw-White, one of Martin Gill's colleagues at Perpetuity, and I'll be chairing today's session. And today, I believe, is our 182nd Thought Leadership webinar. And today's topic, as you know, is falling victim to fraudsters. How do you stop it, and what do you do if you're victimised? As many of you already know, we're here every week, usually on a Thursday afternoon, examining a topic of central interest to the prevention of crime. And the idea of our thought leadership webinars is that we critique today in order to get a better type of prevention for tomorrow. It's our intention not to try and solve all the world's issues in one session, but more to try and encourage new thinking and ideas and raise awareness, to debate what's going on and to put forward different perspectives to change current practices. A copy of this webinar will be put on our website tomorrow, so it can be referred to in the future. And we know from our statistics that a lot of people view these webinars afterwards. Fraud is now the most common offence in the UK, and there's a sense that offenders have adapted quicker in their modus operandi than those responsible for preventing and responding to this crime. There was once a view that suffering financial loss was much less traumatic than suffering physically through a crime. But thankfully, that's gradually being challenged and changed. But where are we with managing the response to those who have been victimised? What exactly is being done, and where are the gaps? Therefore, the purpose of today's webinar is to discuss why are there so many victims of fraud? What support do victims need? And is getting the money back really their whole priority? And what exactly do we think justice should look like for fraud victims? Today, we're going to hear from two experts who both have immense experience in dealing with victims of fraud and both work very closely together in their real lives. And therefore, we look forward to hearing to what their thoughts are on this topic. So without further ado, what I'm going to do in a second is invite two members of our panel today to introduce themselves. And once they've done that, I'll ask them to make their opening statements. A few minutes when they get to say whatever they want on this particular topic. After that, we'll turn to you, the audience, and to ask your questions. So can I encourage you to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screens? Please try and get your questions in early, and I'll endeavour to include as many as I can in the ensuing discussion. So without further delay, let's go and meet our panel. Let's go first to Bernadette. Bernadette, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Bernadette Lawrie, and I'm the Financial Abuse Safeguarding Officer for Sussex and Surrey Police, and I'm responsible for the introduction of Operation Signature, which is a process to identify, protect and support vulnerable victims of fraud. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. We'll just go over to you now, Lisa. Lisa, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Janice. Hello, everybody. My name's Lisa Mills. I'm the Senior Fraud Manager within Victim Support Sussex. So as an organisation, Victim Support exists to support victims of crime and other traumatic incidents throughout England and Wales. And within my area of the UK in Sussex, I work closely with Bernadette and colleagues within Sussex Police to provide wraparound support service to victims of fraud, and I'm looking forward to expanding on that work with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That's great. Well, without further ado, we'll both go back to inviting our panellists with their opening statements. 5 minutes where they get to say whatever they want on the topic. And don't forget, if you want to ask your questions, I'm just reminding you again, use your question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and include as many questions as we can. Okay, Bernadette, if I can come over to you, your opening statement, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to start really by explaining how Operation Signature came about. So I was working as a police officer in Sussex back in 2010, and I visited a 94-year-old gentleman who'd lost £100,000 to fraud and was in receipt of multiple phone calls and receiving a lot of letters every single day. And what was clear was that he didn't realise he was a victim of fraud himself, and it was brought to our attention by the post office. On intervening with him, What we later discovered was that his son had actually already reported that crime to the police, and the police had not taken it as a report because they hadn't deemed him as a victim. It was a result of that incident that we introduced Operation Signature, which essentially was to change people's mindset and say this is not a victimless crime. These people need safeguarding, and even if we cannot detect these crimes, we cannot always identify the offenders, that doesn't mean there isn't a role for police to play. So we started to introduce simple safeguarding support, things like cutting off, blocking phone numbers, redirecting mail, changing email addresses, getting support services involved, and things like that to cut off the contact between the victim and the fraudster, but also to change people's mindset around fraud and that victim blaming that we so often see. So we tried to change even the terminology that you've been had over, you've been scammed, when in fact it's something that clever, sophisticated criminals are targeting people, and those that are the most vulnerable are likely to suffer the highest losses and the longest term impact. So Operation Signature is a standardised approach which went to National Police Chiefs Council in 2017 and was approved as best practice. So it has been sort of rolled out nationally in various forms, but the concept behind it is to identify vulnerability at first point of contact. So to recognise that some people may not know they're victims of fraud, may need support in protecting themselves from repeat victimization. And that's because fraud is a unique crime. It does happen behind closed doors, so we do rely on other people to report it into us. So it's not something that we see a whole lot of self-reporting, particularly the most vulnerable. And we also need to safeguard people with lasting protection measures. And that's because if you've been a victim of fraud, you're 80% more likely to be re-victimized and retargeted if you change nothing. So sometimes that's a physical, simple change, like changing your email address, changing your bank card, but other times it might be behavioral change and things that people can't do for themselves. So Operation Signature is truly embedded across Sussex and Surrey. We have a wealth of data that we can then access, so we can identify who's falling victim to these crimes, what frauds are on the increase, where the hotspots are, and how they're making their payments and how they're being contacted and things like that. So it enables us to then react accordingly and put support services in place, messaging, and trying to raise awareness and to educate people as best we can so that people know what to look out for, perhaps to stop victimization in the first place as well. So that's Operation Signature. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Bernadette. I'm sure we'll be returning to some of those themes a bit later on, and I'm sure the audience will have some questions about that. I know I have. Just a reminder, if you want to ask any questions, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and so we'll include as many as we can. Okay, I'd like to now go over to Lisa. Lisa, can we please have your opening statement?
Thank you. So following on from Bernie's opening statement, our team within Victim Support Sussex work closely as part of Operation Signature. So we have been operating since 2016, and primarily we are there to help with continuity of support for vulnerable fraud victims. So in effect, that means that an individual who's experienced a fraud will receive tailored support from a fraud caseworker, such as myself. And I feel that victim services have come a long way over that period. And we do like to think that locally we are providing a gold standard for victims, because fraud, as we are aware, is such a wide-ranging crime type. People are often thinking about, where should I go? Who should I report to? And with Operation Signature, there are standardised procedures for ensuring that each individual receives appropriate support. As many of you listening will know, fraud accounts for, certainly in the UK, around 40% of all crime. And as individuals and as communities, we have to think about how best to protect ourselves and others around us. We also have to be conscious of the language that we're using around fraud. So, for example, fraud is often described as something that people fall for, which is something that you would never hear spoken about when talking about a victim of a burglary, for example. And it is about trying to push forward and change the narrative around fraud, because unfortunately such negative language only helps to diminish a victim's sense of self-worth, or potential victims about whether they should report fraud in the first place. So it is something that as a caseworker I encounter on a daily basis, that people are brave enough to report it, but will then express their feelings of embarrassment and shame. And it can have a permanent impact on their lives going forward. So not only emotionally, psychologically, their ability to trust others can be permanently destroyed, and also their sense of the future that they would like to have, because perhaps the money they've lost is not going to come back to them, and that could be a terrifying prospect for any of us. So in terms of the practical support that we would provide to people as caseworkers, so Bernie has touched on some of the measures that can be taken. But for us, it's about initially validating the victim's experience of fraud. It's about, alongside our colleagues in Sussex Police, giving them an honest appraisal of the likely, shall we say, judicial outcome. The facts are that sadly, not as many fraudsters are convicted of these crimes as we would wish. But once again, it's about managing our service users' expectations around that. And that is the reality in terms of resources that are available at the moment. We would also work with them in providing peer support. For example, with our romance fraud victims, that was something that we started locally a couple of years ago. So it's innovations like this that we try to drive forward. And as fraudsters are constantly evolving in their methods and tactics, and clearly all of us have that responsibility to keep moving forward as well, to try and safeguard fraud victims. So whilst I would say that there's obviously more to be done, I'd like to finish on a positive note by saying that in the past 6 years, we have moved a great deal further forward, certainly within Sussex. And I pay credit to Bernadette for obviously all the hard work that she's done in pushing Operation Signature forward, both locally and rolling that out nationally. And I think also within victim support, we are providing a very high standard of service, which obviously I'd like to see replicated, both internally, nationally, but with other support agencies as well, so that it's not a postcode lottery for fraud victims. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot then, Lisa. Can I just remind the audience, any questions? We're going to open the floor up now for questions. I've got quite a few to pose myself, but if you send your questions in, we'll include those as well. Just coming back to you both then, Bernadette, you spoke about seeing different kinds of frauds come in and different hotspots. Could you just explain a little bit more about what you're actually seeing at the moment, so we can just get a better feel of what you're seeing in your locality, and whether your locality is any different to what you understand what else is going on throughout the country? You can just spend a little bit of time describing that to us, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost, there probably isn't a great deal of difference between localities, because fraud is a borderless crime. So a lot of our perpetrators operate overseas, for example, so they're not in the locality committing a crime like a burglar or somebody might, where you would see more hot spotting. That said, obviously we do have doorstep criminals, and we do have courier fraud, which is the impersonating police officer on the phone, who with then a courier element where they turn up at an address and collect cards or cash. So there is a local element, and obviously you will see more hotspots around that. With regards to the vulnerability element, you'll see a different set of fraud types peaking within that group, because when we identify vulnerability, we're looking at essentially people that need our help. So most fraud victims we would deem as not vulnerable, therefore we would offer them the advice and guidance they need to help themselves after an offence, whereas those that perhaps are unwilling or unable to help themselves, and that would include people in denial of the offence, would be the ones that get our assistance. So you're talking about a very different demographic. A lot of them will be elderly, a lot of them will be suffering with mental health or physical health issues, but also we would prioritise some fraud types based on that. So for example, romance fraud, we would treat all victims of romance fraud as vulnerable by fraud type. And that's because of the links to suicide nationally for that sort of crime. So locally, we would see a very high proportion of romance fraud, for example, because we're prioritising those victims. So it might be that other force areas haven't prioritised that, so they've got a much lower reporting. So certainly for us locally, we see an increase in reporting as a positive, because we want to encourage reporting. So when we see local spikes in that, we see that as a positive. But from a vulnerable point of view, definitely our top offences are courier fraud, romance fraud, investment fraud, computer software service fraud, which is kind of the Microsoft scam, as we used to term it, when somebody phones somebody up, tells them they've got a problem with their computer, and then takes over control. So those are kind of, and obviously we do see financial abuse by a known person. So sadly, sometimes people are being defrauded by people that they know and sometimes trust as well, be it family, friends, carers, handymen that have, you know, whatever, befriended people. So we will see that element. On a non-vulnerable scale, we see frauds like online shopping, for example, as a very prevalent one that will come in peaks and troughs throughout the year, but very consistently online frauds will remain quite high. So you've got kind of two types here. You've got the ones that are particularly ruthless and targeting the vulnerable, and you've got the sort of the wider, more generic, perhaps, that you and I would see, phishing emails, that calls from HMRC, Amazon scams, delivery scams, things like that. We see a lot of that for the wider public, less so for the vulnerable.
Okay, thanks, Bernadette. Before I come to you, Lisa, to ask you a few questions, I'll just come back to Bernadette. We've had a question in, and I think I know the answer, but I'll just make sure I'm correct on this. Somebody's asked, is op signature a local, as in sort of UK only, or it's not adopted globally, is it? Or if it's not adopted globally, do you know of any similar sort of schemes in different countries?
So it's not adopted internationally in its form, and that's because really it works alongside action fraud, which obviously is only something which we have in the UK. So I have once spoken to the police in Gibraltar, for example, and they've taken on their own version of this. Obviously what they don't have is the rerouting of calls for action fraud. So for us, we're saying we're identifying vulnerability as a call for service for the purposes of action fraud reporting. So we're saying we're not going to send them off to action fraud, we're going to take them ourselves and record that on their behalf and deal with them. So the concept could easily be adopted. Essentially, we're saying vulnerable victims need some safeguarding and support, and if you standardize that, then you can create something that you can then use the data to inform your wider activity.
And just finally, before I hand over to Lisa Moore, for those of the audience that are not in the UK, could you just quickly outline what action fraud is for us, please, Bernadette?
Yes, of course, sorry. So action fraud is the national recording place for all fraud in the UK. So, and it's been in place for around 7-8 years now, and it's kind of run by the City of London Police, but it's a national process whereby people are diverted, if you like, to report to action fraud rather than to their local police force. So it means that because of that borderless element of fraud, that there is an intelligence function or an analytical function within it, that they will collate reports based on where the suspect resides and send them out to a local force for investigation. So rather than each force have the report to carry themselves.
Okay, thanks a lot then, Bernadette. If I could just come to you, Lisa. I think sometimes we don't, those of us who've not been scammed or not working in this area don't realise quite how devastating this is from victims. Could you perhaps just explain to us a little bit more about that so we could get a better feel of the kinds of things that victims are sort of put under?
Of course. So like I touched upon in my opening statement, sometimes we are the first people that victims spoken to. So within this role, the referrals come directly from Sussex Police, but we can have self-referrals from fraud victims if they don't feel able to, at that point, contact their local police force. So the frauds that we see are many and varied. And once again, Bernie touched on the prevalent ones that we see within our support mechanism. So romance fraud accounted for around 25% of our total fraud referrals over the last year. So clearly a very high proportion. And we are, particularly with that fraud type, often supporting people who may be in denial at the start. So there's a lot of conversation now around the social grooming and the coercive control elements of this fraud type. So whereas people are not necessarily being threatened, they are being subjected to the manipulation employed by the fraudsters in directing them what to do and being emotionally manipulated. So, of course, when somebody like me comes along and supports that victim, and the light bulb moment, if you like, happens and the victim realises that they've been lied to, then they are mourning the loss of what to them was a genuine relationship. So that's very, very painful for me to witness, but obviously even more so for that victim to go through. So that's one example. Everyone has their unique experience, but I think a common theme running through it all would be that people have just had their confidence destroyed, and it is now about second guessing every single person almost in their life, because that's the nature of fraud. So we have unfortunately supported people who have expressed suicidal thoughts, who have taken out crippling loans or have remortgaged their homes and have gotten into, astronomical debt because of fraud, and a pervading sense from the victims that they have no self-worth anymore. So hence our support will be quite time intensive, because we are there for as long as the victim feels it helps them to cope and recover. So it's not an easy thing for somebody to get that sense of self-esteem back. And also they may need help in speaking with their banks, for example, about what's happened, in trying to reclaim their money back, which is unfortunately not always a positive outcome, but we do help to strive to work with them on that. And as I say, a peer support group for people can be a great advantage, because whilst we get positive feedback about our work as caseworkers, we don't have that lived experience. So by them being in the same room as other victims, that's been a leap forward in victim services recently. So just to finish off this answer, I would say that once again, it's about really fostering feelings of anger towards the people that are committing the crimes, and not the negative tropes that we hear against victims, because no one has willingly given their money to a fraudster. They have been manipulated, they have been coerced. And after the realisation of what's happened to them, they need to be aware of where to go for support, because it's not necessarily going to be a quick bounce back process for that person.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. That was interesting. Certainly when you talked about the light bulb moment of individuals, and I think sometimes we take that for granted, that if people have contacted the police and contacted yourselves, that they've actually faced up to actually what has actually happened to them. And I know from having talked to other colleagues in other countries that have conducted research on victims of fraud, that's not always the case, and that it is very difficult to actually sometimes get over to the person that they actually have been scammed and are continually being scammed. And I remember a colleague of mine actually undertaking some interviews in Australia, going around to individual victims' homes, and the interview sort of getting suspended because the scammer was still on the phone, but the individual still felt it was more important to maintain that relationship and to keep talking to the individual scammer. And then, you know, that light bulb moment hadn't happened. And I think sometimes we very, very much underestimate the sort of social engineering and the cleverness of the individual scams, certainly to these vulnerable and older groups. I think that's quite an important area. If I could just come back to you for a moment, Bernadette, and then I might come back to you then, Lisa, on a similar one. We've had a question here from Andrew Knight, and I'm just reading the question to you now then for your comment. The impression given by many police forces is that domestic fraud is down to the victim and not of interest to them. This promotes the stigma and allows the offender a free rein to operate. Do the panelists agree, and how do you change that? Well, I'd like to think that there's already gone, certainly in your area, some degree of change. You could just make some comments on that, perhaps, Bernadette.
Yeah, I think it is something that people have voiced and will continue to voice, I'm sure. I mean, I've been working and pioneering this in this space for several years. And while sometimes it might feel like you're pushing on an open door, you have got to really change people's mindset. And I think in certainly historically, there was a mindset that, you know, fraud was a victimless crime, and also that victims were being stupid, being greedy, being whatever, but and they weren't seeing it, that they were being manipulated, exploited, coerced, and all the things that we've talked about. So essentially, no, they weren't being taken seriously by all police forces when they made their initial complaint, which is, as I described, the case that first came to my attention, having already failed that initial intervention. So yeah, I do think there's still a long way to go. I'd like to hope that those feelings aren't experienced from anybody in Sussex or Surrey, but I think there is still need for more cohesive acknowledgement and process to accept the fraud element of fraud, and the fact that these victims need the same level of care and support as other crime types.
Okay, thank you, Bernadette. Just staying with you for the moment, I've got another question here from Katrina Morton, who says she works for a high street retailer, and she says that sometimes they get the impression of the police, because there's no obvious sort of vulnerable victim, they're not sort of getting the same kind of service that maybe a vulnerable individual would get. However, that they're not so much worried, you know, just about the fraud itself, but really what the fraud can enable and what it leads to. But she was wondering, the general question was sort of around, you know, are the police seen like the bigger picture here of other things that this could lead to, and how do you all work together within different kinds of frauds and victims within the police?
Yeah, so I think that is the sort of ethos behind Action Fraud, if you like. You know, was that was their best intention, was to create a national recording place for fraud, so that the systems could talk to each other and they could identify series and trends and feed that out, rather than 43 forces having a separate sort of knowledge base and system of what's going on in the fraud space. And that's from a victim point of view, but also an investigative point of view as well. So I think that is sort of an advantage to having a national recording system, is that there is a cohesion there, but clearly more to be done, definitely.
Okay, sure. Lisa, we talked a bit earlier about being re-victimised. Could you just explain a little bit for the audience, especially those that are not familiar within the UK, about sort of scammers lists and repeat victimisation through those?
Of course. So it's something that we always have a conversation with the victims around. So, for example, a victim of investment fraud could then be subjected to investment recovery fraud. So it will be part of the same criminal gang that will contact Mr. Smith, you know, and feign their interest in his situation, and show, you know, their compassion about trying to help him get his funds back. So we are obviously alert to it as practitioners working in this field. And as I say, we have to make our service users aware of the reality that they may be retargeted. There are so many mechanisms now for this being done, and there have been in prior years, you know, the explosion of technology and social media. So it's about not responding to random requests that come through media platforms, and the usual advice around safeguarding about not clicking on links, for example, in text messages and emails. And I think that a good example really of the hold that the fraudsters can have over people is going back to, you know, romance relationship fraud, where people may have a negative experience, but then their desire to have a relationship may mean that they are retargeted by somebody online, and so it's trying to break that cycle again to explain that they are being retargeted, because the fraudster will know that they've gained money from this person, albeit using a different alias, and they are now coming back for more. So people are clearly being left damaged by their experiences, and as part of the joined up police response and victim support service response in Sussex, we do want to ensure that people are at such a small risk of being re-victimised. So our methods that we employ to use that are, as we've discussed, you know, target hardening measures, support mechanisms, knowing that they can speak to a caseworker if something is concerning them. And I think, you know, without having the figures to hand, historically, our rates have been very low. So we must be doing something right. But obviously, we're always looking at other ways to innovate and to lock down that risk to the people that we support.
Okay, thank you. We've touched on this topic before, as you've said, that quite often victims, in a way that maybe it's not seen with other crimes, when it comes to fraud crimes, being a victim of fraud, you're sort of seen as greedy, gullible, or silly, which you perhaps wouldn't be with other crimes. How does this actually impact on victims in terms of how they actually, or whether they do report the individual crimes, and how it affects them, how they feel and go forward with the whole process? Bernadette, can I ask you first on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you know, we've talked about fraud being almost half of all crime, reported crime. It's also the most underreported crime that there is. And one of the reasons it is underreported, obviously, we've talked about people not recognising they're a victim, but when they do recognise they're a victim, they're reluctant to report because of that embarrassment. And obviously that's something that we do try and educate against and encourage that reporting, because if we don't know something's happened, how we can ever look to invest more resources and things like that into dealing with that kind of crime. And people don't know if they're going to be taken seriously or not. But also, I think one of the realities around the underreporting of fraud is because people, they want their money back, they want the suspect caught. If they're particularly bothered, they want to stop other people falling victim to it. But really, if we can't deliver on those points for them, then that's not going to encourage people to report. So so we need to, you know, we do really need to move away from that sense that victims are to blame in any sense of this, and sort of bring them away.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of, and you sort of started on my next question really there, of what victims want. I'm going to ask both of you this, if you perhaps want to answer it first, Lisa. What is it what is it that actually victims want usually? And I suppose what we're asking on the wider question is, what does justice look like for a fraud victim? You know, what would be regarded as a good outcome?
I think initially for many of the people that we support, they are appreciative that they're actually being listened to, that they're not just batted away, that they are made to feel that fraud is a serious crime with consequences, which it obviously is. Once again, they have had an initial visit from, a Sussex officer, and feedback is always overwhelmingly positive, which clearly is a great start in the process. So we go forward from there with the victim support. And yes, people do express to me that they would like the perpetrator to be brought to justice, that would help them. But going back to what I said before, I'm not within law enforcement, and clearly Bernadette and her colleagues will know what the realities are in terms of resources and following the trail of people that are normally based overseas when we're talking about online crime. So it's about managing the expectations, and people will obviously want to try and get their money back. So once again, there are practical measures that myself and my colleagues can take in providing advocacy for victims, but that is not always successful. So it can be the double whammy that people, A, don't have their day in court, and B, may not get their money back. So we're never promising that we're going to go in there and, help to solve their wish list. But I think it still goes back to the fact that people want what's happened to them to be validated and acknowledged, and to have that support when no other support may be around them for them to lean to, such as family and friends. So it's a wide-ranging subject, but I think essentially people just want to have fraud acknowledged now, with the severity of the scale of it and knowing where to turn to, which hasn't always been evident in the past. And without going on for too much longer, I think for all professionals in this industry, it's about messaging, but it's about where that messaging is going to be effective. So, we can have literature, we can have fraud campaigns, but are the people that I support necessarily going to be seeing that messaging? So it's something that we revisit quite often, and we need it to be impactful, because as much as I'm supporting victims, we want to prevent more people not getting to that stage.
Okay, I don't know if you've got any further comments there, Bernadette. And one of the things that Lisa mentioned there was managing expectations. Now we know that the police are absolutely overwhelmed with the amount of fraud they're trying to deal with at the moment. So how do you go about managing a victim of fraud's expectations?
Well, I think we do have to be completely honest with them, in the sense that, statistically, I believe only 5% of fraud is investigated. So the chances of a detection are obviously slimmer than that. We can't arrest someone we haven't identified. So obviously we can only deal with what's in front of us, and unfortunately, with a huge amount of the perpetrators remaining unidentified and overseas, there just isn't the capacity or the resource within the local forces to action that. But we obviously, Lisa touched on it about getting people's money back for them. We've recently introduced a process with the banks called the Bank Notification Scheme, where we can notify a bank on a victim's behalf of their vulnerabilities, and we've seen some huge successes in victims' funds being repatriated, where the bank are accepting the loss by acknowledging that perhaps the victim is vulnerable and shouldn't be the one that carries that loss themselves. So I think it's about not just sort of working in solely as the police and law enforcement. We've got to rely on society as a whole. So, organisations like the banking sector play a really key part in protecting their customers, identifying fraud, preventing fraud, and reporting fraud as well. So I think it's a collective responsibility, as is it a personal responsibility as well, to protect yourself from fraud. And obviously, we've talked a lot about vulnerable people that perhaps are less able to do that, but They do, again, they estimate, I think it's about 80% of fraud is preventable. So if we were all doing what we perhaps need to be doing, whether it's online safety, whether it's behavioural things, whether it's things, education, but we see new crime types coming onto the scene as tactics develop, and we need to be quicker at getting that protection out there.
Okay, thank you. Well, just before we start to wrap up this session, I'm just going to return to the panelists. We've had a couple of questions in which I'm just going to combine, which is basically saying, you know, what's the quick and easy and effective things that you could do to stop yourself being defrauded and scammed, you know. So I suppose I want to ask the panel in turn, if I can come to you first, Lisa. You know, if you've got top 3 tips or whatever, what would you say to individuals who are listening today?
I would say generally just be aware by, you know, going online to look at local resources, you know, about scam prevention, in terms of there's never a stupid question. So, you know, reach out to somebody if you're in doubt. It's about taking a breath. Don't feel pressurized, whether that's someone at your front door, someone's on the phone, someone is trying to not giving you a chance to rationalize your own thoughts. So without being over cynical, I think it goes back to the sense that we cannot really take anybody at face value in the sort of climate that we live in now. That's not to say that we should think everyone is out to get us, but potentially that person on the phone could be trying to harvest our information. So I think it's just about reaching out to somebody that you trust, and somebody at the end of the phone, you don't know who they are, and that's why something like courier fraud, so telephone impersonation fraud, unfortunately has been so successful in recent years, because when they're using the guise of a police officer, most people will sit up and take notice, and maybe park negative thoughts behind, because they think, oh, I can't question a police officer, I'll go along with what they're telling me. So yeah, I think essentially I would just say take a breath, stop and think, and just read up on scams that are out there at the moment, and look for resources through sites such as Sussex Police and Victim Support. There's so many resources available now, which are being updated. So yeah, that's probably how I would sum it up.
Okay, thanks. And just over to you, Bernadette.
Thank you. Yeah, well, one thing which I would always say is if it sounds or looks too good to be true, then it probably is. So I think that's a really, you know, something to remember, whether you're talking about investment fraud, whether you're talking about a lottery win, whether you're getting an HMRC rebate or council tax rebate, anything like that. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And to echo really what Lisa said, anybody can be anyone. So whether that's on the phone, whether that's hiding behind a false profile picture, whether it's something we've seen a lot of recently, people on webcams, you know, chatting to somebody late at night on a webcam, could be anybody behind that. So don't just believe that you know what you're dealing with. I think we've got to all be a lot less trusting and a lot more alert. But I think the other thing is just a bit of a personal responsibility. You know, if you buy a new gadget, you read the manual, you know, you go online, you know, we're not all educated about what to do, you know, and effectively we're not going to leave our house unlocked. So why are we leaving our online safety unlocked and exposed? So I think we all just need to acknowledge that we do have a sense of personal responsibility as well. And as Lisa said, those resources are out there to tap into. So I think we need to sometimes make the effort to go and find them ourselves and share that with each other.
Okay, well, thank you both for a very insightful discussion there. Fascinating topic. I'm sure we've run webinars before on victims of victimisation and fraud. I'm sure we'll be returning to this in the future. Okay, if I might, just before we wrap up, I've got a few notices, and we've got the OSPAs open now in Nigeria, South Africa, Romania and the US. We've got the, more for this audience, the Tackling Economic Crime Awards, which I'm sure you'll be very interested in, is now open. Back to real life events at long last, and in New Zealand in a couple of weeks' time we have the Oscars award events there, and towards the end of May we've got the Irish Oscars. If you want to come and see us, either for security or economic crime, come and see us at the security event at the NEC in Birmingham between the 25th and the 27th of April. We're on stand 4/M40. And the next thought leadership will be, as usual, on a Thursday afternoon in 2 weeks' time, 13th of April, when we'll be considering crime and cybersecurity products. And 2 weeks later, on the 27th, we'll be back looking at equality, diversity and inclusion in organisations. Once again, many thanks to the panel. So thank you, the audience, for your insightful questions. To Shrey behind the scenes for all his work organising this event. Don't forget there'll be a copy of this webinar on the website tomorrow, along with the blog. I hope to see you all again. Until then, as we always say, wherever you are in the world, please stay safe.